seduction of the runner in the night, blinded by the light, wrapped up like a douche, another runner in the night, blinded by the light.
SMC! Good to see you guys. I love that song. You guys all know that song, right? Yeah. Blinded by the light. And then the next phrase, maybe a little more uncomfortable to say on stage, right? Here's the real lyrics. Blinded by the light, revved up like a deuce, another runner in the night. Who knew? Because for the last 30 plus years, I've been singing about women's hygiene products in that song. And here's what I realized with that song, is there's a lot of things in life we think we know. We're convinced we're right, and we're actually wrong. For example, my daughter years ago, she's a tough girl. And we were outside playing, and she was running, and she slipped on some wet grass and fell on her arm. And she usually just pops up, no big deal, and she stays on the ground, and she's starting to tear up a little bit. And she never cries. And I walked up to her, I was like, Ryra, are you okay? And she goes, my arm really hurts. And I go, okay, hey, why don't you get up really quick? And I have her get up, and I kind of look at her arm, and I was like, okay, here's what you need to do. You need to move your arm around a lot. So I have her do these big circles, and every time she moves her arm, she's like, Dad, this really hurts. I'm like, I know it does, baby girl. But here's the deal. That pain is just the process of injury and weakness leaving your body. And she's like, but it really hurts. I'm like, I know. The more it hurts, the better it is. And so she's moving her arm, and my wife is cringing. We wait 24 hours to take her to the hospital. I just keep having her move her arm. She gets an x-ray, and when she gets done with the x-ray people come to the table she's on, and they're like, are you okay? And she's like, yeah, I'm fine. And they go, here, let us stabilize your arm and help you get back to the doctor's office. The worst thing you can do with this arm is to move it. She had just straight shattered her humerus. I thought the best thing was to have her move it around. Was convinced I was right. My youngest daughter, she used to be a close talker. And so she would talk like right in your face. And it was cute when she was young. And after a while, it just got annoying. And so she would talk close. And as a dad, I'm like, I don't want her to be that person for the rest of her life that's talking right in people's faces. So I was like, hey, you don't need to talk that close to me. You can back up. And she was like, oh, she didn't even know she was doing it. She's like, oh, okay. And then, within a minute later, she's like right back in my face again. And after a while, I was like, Kaylee, back up. I mean, I didn't say it that mean, right? I mean, I was just, Kaylee, back off. You don't need to get right in my face. And she's like, oh. Well, we wait years and get her eyes checked. And she had a major stigmatism in her right eye. She was basically blind. And here I am as a dad wanting to be a good dad, not to have my daughter be a close talker. But she just couldn't see me. Like, that's why she was in my face. There are things in life we are convinced we're right about, that we know, kind of like that song. But what if we think we know what it means to follow Jesus, but we're wrong? Or at least slightly off. See, I think most of us in this room, for most of our lives, if you've grown up in church, I didn't, but if you've grown up in church, I think you've gotten bad or at best, slightly skewed, incomplete information on what it means to follow Jesus. And so you've been running on assumptions of what it means to be a follower of Christ. And so what I want to do tonight is I just want to look at what Jesus says it means to follow him. We need to go to the source. Not surprisingly, very early in Jesus' ministry, he tells us. In each of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in Matthew 4, in Mark 1, and in Luke 5, Jesus tells us the very first words that he speaks to his disciples, the first guys he calls, are very clear on what it means to be a follower of his. Look at this, Matthew 4:19. This will be familiar to some of you. Come, follow me, Jesus says, and I will make you fishers of men. These are the first words Jesus speaks to any of his disciples. Really clear. I hope you guys are taking notes. If not, take out your phone. I want you to write this down. This is going to be the point of everything I say tonight, because this is what Jesus says it means to follow him. And here it is. To follow is to fish. To follow is to fish. To follow Jesus is to fish for people. That's what Jesus says. So if you're not fishing for people, it begs the question, are you following Jesus? And Jesus would say no. The first 4 people Jesus calls are fishermen. That's the context, it helps. But the group of 12, the original 12 disciples that Jesus calls, is a really unique ragtag bunch of guys. And I want to share 2 characteristics that are going to appear like glaring characteristics of why Jesus should not have chosen them. But for us, they're going to be compelling, encouraging reasons. Okay, write these down. Here's the first. His original 12 had no formal theological training. None. They had no formal religious training. These were typical, average, common guys. They were not members of a privileged class that could afford higher religious education. They weren't a part of a unique, special religious class that would have given them the opportunity to sit under an esteemed or renowned scholar. These were untrained, unskilled guys that had no training in teaching or preaching or reaching others. That's one characteristic. Here's the other one. They were young. They were really young. Most likely between the ages of 15 and 20, possibly as young as 13. Now, we don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us here's exactly how old they are. But there's some indicators that tell us they were young. Here's one. None of them were married except for Peter. In our day and age, that doesn't matter much. But in Jewish culture, it was expected that Jewish men be married by the age of 20. So it means that all these guys were under 20, and you could marry as young as 15. Point number 2, James and John, when they're called, they were working with their father, which means they were at least 13 because they were working full-time in the family business, but they weren't old enough to take over the family business from their dad, under 20. And here's another one. In Matthew 20, later in the book of Matthew, they've been following Jesus for a while. 2 of the disciples have their mom go and ask Jesus if they can sit on his right and on his left in the coming kingdom. I haven't asked my mom to go and ask somebody on my behalf in a long, long time. Probably most of you haven't. You do that when you're a teenager, when you're really young. So think about this. These disciples were untrained. They were unschooled. They had no formal training. And they were really, really young. I think most of us have a tendency to think really, really highly of the original 12. That they were these unbelievably skilled and trained guys. Most likely, 11 teenagers and Peter. That's the original 12. What does that mean for us? Here's why this is so significant. We have no excuses. We have no excuses not to be people who follow and fish. You don't need to be trained. You don't need to be some seasoned age. You just need to be people who are willing to take Jesus at his word and to follow him and to fish for people. See, following Christ isn't just about not sinning as much as the next guy. It's not just about escaping hell. It's not just about waiting and living in obscurity for a while until you get to go to heaven. No. Jesus, he made you for so much more. So much more. And we don't have excuses. I've got 3 kids, currently between the ages of 13 and 18. And my wife and I have done everything we can to pray for our kids and to instill in them to be people that follow and fish. When my son was about 12, it was the first time I ever verbally heard him share the gospel. And he's in our minivan, and he's got his buddy in the back of the minivan, and I hear him do his best that he can to share this verse, Romans 6:23, with his buddy. I didn't tell him to. He just started to try to share it with him. He asked his buddy, the way he asked him, he goes, hey, so I don't know, what do you think about this? Do you want to be a Christian? That was how he ended the conversation. And this 12-year-old goes, I don't think so. And to my surprise, Mace goes, okay, I get it. He goes, well, what if we met in a couple days and talked a little bit more about it? 12 years old, he's setting up a follow-up appointment with this dude that just said no at 12. My son's a gamer. He plays video games, and it's very, very common for me to hear him with a headset on sharing the gospel with random people that he's playing video games with. Just 2 weeks ago, Mason's playing, he plays this game Rocket League, and he's actually pretty good at it. And I could tell he was a little flustered, and I was like, hey, dude, what's going on? And he goes, man, this guy that I just played with just cursed me out the whole game. He goes, I missed this one block, and literally he just cursed me out. And I go, what'd you say? And he goes, well, I just finally told him, I said, hey, man, Jesus loves you. And I go, what'd he say? And he goes, oh, he just cursed me out more. And I was like, oh, okay. And he goes, but I found him on, I remember if it was Discord or something. He found him somewhere, maybe PlayStation. And he took a screenshot. He texted the guy. Here's what he texted him. He said, hey, you need to let Jesus into your heart. This is a dude that just cursed him out for a whole game. Then he says this, saying stuff like that is going to catch up to you sometime in life, dog. D-A-W-G, just so you know, he's got it. He didn't expect the guy to respond. He just wanted to text him. And here's what this guy says. You know what? You're right. Mason keeps talking to him. The guy says, are you some pastor? And Mace goes, nah, man, I'm 18. And the guy says this, I appreciate your advice. I needed a wake-up call. My son has no training. He's young. My daughter, when she was in 4th grade, she came up to my wife and I, and she said, hey, I want to start a Bible study. So 4th grade's like 10 or 11 years old. She goes, hey, I want to start a Bible with some friends. Is that okay? And we're like, yeah, you can use the house, which means we're going to have to pick these kids up. And you would assume a 10 or 11-year-old girl is going to invite like friends from church, just some Christian girls. She invites 10 of her friends. Only 2 of them are in church families. The rest of them are all girls that she thinks are far from God. At 10 or 11 years old. And these girls would come every week. Their moms would drop them off, or my wife would pick them up. And I came home early one day from work and walked into our living room. All the girls are there. And my daughter, at 10 or 11, has a whiteboard, and she's sharing Romans 6:23 with a group of other 10 or 11-year-old girls. My youngest, she's 13. Teenage years are rough when you're a girl, a middle school girl. And there's some kids in class that are just punks. They're just jerks. And there's one kid intentionally is rude to her. And I'll ask my daughter from time to time, hey, how are you doing? And she'll say, okay. And she doesn't say this every time. But I'll say, how are you doing with that kid? And she goes, I'm just praying. I'm just praying for his heart. I don't tell you those stories to impress you about my kids. My kids are watching. Kids, you're not special, okay? There's nothing radically awesome about you. My kids are common, average kids. They did grow up in my home, okay, so they're probably a little weird. I tell you that to say, what's your excuse? You don't have any excuses. You don't need to be trained. You don't need to be a certain age. You can be young and untrained. I want you to think about the types of people that Jesus passed up choosing to be his original 12. Think of who he didn't choose. He didn't choose religious leaders. He didn't choose political leaders. He didn't choose celebrities. He didn't choose the wealthy. He didn't choose the elite. He didn't choose CEO or business leaders. He chose a ragtag bunch of 12 young people who were untrained, idealistic, hardworking, unruly, but willing to follow and fish. And think about the results. In a strange way, the 3,000 of us are a result of these 12 guys following and fishing. 12 teenagers that just said, all right, I'll do it. And they followed and they fished. And they helped others follow and fish, who helped others follow and fish, who helped others follow and fish. And here we are. I can't help but think there's 3,000 of you, young, untrained, for sure unruly, hardworking, idealistic college students. What could he do with you? Have you ever thought about that? What could he do with you if you were just willing to follow and fish? Here's what's amazing about those 12. The types of people Jesus didn't choose to be in his original 12, those types of people were reached. They reached the religious leaders. They reached the political leaders. They reached celebrities. They reached the elite. They reached the wealthy. They reached CEO and business leaders. They reached all of them because they recognized that following Jesus wasn't just about them, it was about reaching others, following and fishing. They were made for so much more. You were made for so much more than just sitting and intaking. You were made to fish. Here's why this means so much to me. I didn't grow up a committed follower of Christ. I got invited to go to a party when I was 18. And I showed up to this party and there was a guy fishing. His name was Dave. And I took the bait. And Dave met with me for the next 4 to 5 weeks. I didn't have a Bible. I'd never really read the Bible. Dave got me a Bible. And here's what Dave did. Dave shared what God had done in his life. Dave also didn't grow up a follower of Jesus, and so he shared how God got a hold of his life. And then he just shared things that God was teaching him as he was reading the Bible. To be totally honest with you, there was nothing profound that Dave did with me. He shared what God had done in his life, and he shared what God was teaching him. Every one of you can do that. And after 4 to 5 weeks, I gave my life to Christ and committed to follow him. I went to college at CU, Boulder. There we go. What are you guys booing? That we won 4 games? We had a few more wins than last year. There was no Stumo at CU. I went to high school with a guy who was a few years older than me named Sean Vollendorf. He spoke the first night. We're both from Silverthorne, Colorado. And I called Sean, and Sean was involved with this ministry called Stumo in a different state. And I said, hey, man, I just started following Jesus. I don't know what to do. And Sean invited me to this thing called SMC. And he told me what it was all about, and I was like, man, that's what I need. I'll be there. Well, my car wasn't in the shape to make that type of trip from Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, to Tulsa, Oklahoma is where I needed to get to. I didn't have enough money for a plane ticket, and so when you can't fly and you can't drive, you have one option. Greyhound, baby. I don't know the last time you were on Greyhound. My guess would be maybe never. When you're on Greyhound, you meet a lot of unique and thought-provoking people. One of the thoughts it provokes is, why did I ever take Greyhound? But I took Greyhound. Greyhound, they take different routes. Okay, so from Silverthorne, Colorado to Tulsa, it's about an 11-hour drive in a car. But Greyhound likes to show you the country. And so it took 20 hours. 20 hours in a Greyhound bus. I show up to SMC and my life is transformed because all of a sudden I'm meeting college students my age as a freshman in college who were following and fishing. I'm meeting guys that are sophomores and juniors, girls that are sophomores, juniors, seniors, and they're introducing me to people that they have led to Christ. My mind was blown. I was like, wow, I can do this? Yeah, you can do this. So I hopped back on that Greyhound bus for the short 20-hour trip back to Colorado after SMC, and I wanted to start fishing. And so I just decided I'm going to start sharing the gospel on this Greyhound. And so we had several different stints, so I got to share with several guys. But one guy, he was this big country guy from Texas, and he had this massive dip-in. I mean, just huge. And the only thing he brought on the bus was a log of tobacco cans. So a log is just a bunch of tobacco cans that they like seal together, and he just walked on with this log, and he sits down, and then he just holds the log with a big dip in his mouth. And I'm like, okay, time to go fishing. So I start sharing the gospel with this guy, and he's nodding his head, and I get done, and I ask him, you know, there's one question, the most important question that any human can ask another human. Do you want to place your trust in Christ today? And this guy, he looks back at me, and he goes, man, I'm just so convicted right now. I'm never going to dip again. We didn't talk about dipping. I don't know what he was even talking about. And then he did something I'll never forget. He looks at his log of tobacco. He lowers the window, and he just throws it out the window of the bus. I don't know if the dude he never answered my question. He just said he wouldn't dip again, and he threw it out the bus. I got back to Boulder, and I knew I needed somebody that was further along than me, that had been following and fishing a little longer than I had. And I got introduced to this guy named Jerry, and he had been following and fishing a lot longer than I had because he was almost 70. There was no Stumo, and so there just wasn't this ministry that I was able to plug into at the time. And so I meet Jerry, and Jerry and I met almost every Wednesday for the next 3.5 years. Jerry was a remarkable guy. He wore a sport coat everywhere he was, and he would carry in his sport coat a thin-line Bible on the inside pocket. And I started to notice after a while meeting with Jerry would ask me to open up my Bible to a section of Scripture, and Jerry wouldn't pull his Bible out. Jerry would do this. He would tap his chest, he would close his eyes, and his eyes would kind of flutter. It was a little freaky. He was scrolling. He was scrolling in his mind. And then he would start saying what I was reading or seeing. And he did this for a while, and I was like, this is really strange. I was like, surely he doesn't know the whole Bible, right? So for our next meeting, I hadn't read the whole Bible yet, and so I just went into the Old Testament. I found the most obscure Bible, title of a book that I could find. And there's this book called Obadiah. How many of you have read Obadiah? Handful. How many of you didn't even know there was a book named Obadiah? Yeah, that was me. I didn't either. And so I was like, there's no way Jerry can know all this book. And so I meet with Jerry that Wednesday, and I sit down. I go, hey, Jerry, I've been reading an Obadiah, and I just have a question for you. He goes, yes, yes, yes. He said yes, yes to everything. Yes, yes. I was like, okay, he's acting like he knows Obadiah. There's no way. And I go, hey, Jerry, in Obadiah chapter 3, and he goes, there's not 3 chapters. There's only 1. I was like, good job, you pass. That was test number 1, and you passed it. Okay, in Obadiah 1, and I was like, I better pick a pretty low number. I don't know how many verses are in this book. So I was like, in Obadiah 1:4, and his eyes would flutter. And I was like, there's no way. And sure enough, he opens his eyes. Even though you soar like eagles and you have nests, he starts to quote it. Unbelievable. Jerry loved God's word. But what Jerry did for me is he didn't just give me a love for God's word. Jerry would let me watch him fish. He would share the gospel with people in the union when we met. He would take me to his house when he was meeting with people to hear him share. Jerry's basement had pictures around the entire, all four walls. And they were pictures of people that he had led to Christ and baptized. I don't know how many pictures there were. Probably about a year and a half into Jerry and I meeting, Jerry gets a phone call, a random number, and Jerry picks up. And the guy on the other end says, "Is this Jerry?" And Jerry goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "My name's Mike. You shared the gospel with me 20 years ago. And in the last month, I haven't been able to get it off my mind. And I just wanted to see if I could ask you some questions." And Jerry goes, "Where do you live?" And he goes, "Well, I live in Missouri." And he goes, "No, where do you live? What's your address?" And the guy gives him his address, and he goes, "I'll be there tomorrow." And Jerry hopped in his car and drove over 7 hours to share the gospel with one guy. As Jerry got older, Jerry got moved into assisted living with his wife Normadine, which, Normadine, number one, is that not an amazing name for an old woman? Normadine. Normadine and Jerry, they came and spoke at some kaleos that we were at. I got to tell this. Don't have this in my notes. But Normadine would sit in the front couple rows, and Jerry would be teaching, okay, at a kaleo, in a main session at a kaleo. And you would hear Normadine halfway through one of Jerry's stories, and she would say this, No, Jerry. Jerry, you're not telling that story right." She would cut him off. Every talk. And Jerry never was, he was unflappable. He would go, "Now, dear, I'm not done with the story yet. Let me just keep telling a story." And she'd go, "Oh, okay, carry on." Jerry and Normadine got moved into this assisted living nursing home, and I would talk to Jerry often, and I would ask him, "Jerry, how are things going in the assisted living, in the nursing home?" And he goes, "Great." He goes, "I'm doing a Bible study and people want to come," which the translation was Jerry just told people there's a Bible study and that they would be there, and people would show up. I remember asking Jerry, "You sharing the gospel?" And he goes, "Brandon, that's my bag. That's my bag." Jerry shared until his last days. When I'd call Jerry, Jerry would say this every single phone call. He'd pick up and I'd say, "Hey, Jerry, this is Brandon." And he'd go, "Brandon, my son in the Lord," every time. "My son in the Lord." And then at some point in the conversation, he would say these things. "Brandon, you know you're my legacy. You're a link in a long chain of a lot of people who followed Jesus." And then he would say this, "Don't break the chain." So I've done my best not to break the chain. I want to honor the Lord first and foremost, but I want to honor Jerry's investment in me. So I came on staff with Stumo, and I wanted to try to reach people that were like me, far from God. And there was a fraternity that wouldn't let me in their house for several years. I would offer gift cards. I just wanted to talk to their pledges. And every year they said the same thing to me. It was like they passed down this line to the future pledge trainers and presidents. Every single semester I'd call. And they would say this, "We know who you are and we know what you're about and we don't want any of it." And in my pride, I'm like, "You don't know me. You don't know what I'm about." They definitely did. They definitely knew what I was about and they didn't want any of it. Well, I got close with some guys in a different fraternity, and I ended up asking them, I was like, "Hey, do you guys know anybody in this house?" And they're like, "Yeah, actually, we party with several of them, and we know the guy." And I go, "What do you mean?" They go, "Well, he goes by the Godfather." And I laughed. I was like, "Are you messing with me?" And they're like, "No, literally, that's what he goes by, the Godfather." They give me this number. I called it. I was like, "I'm getting pranked." Expecting the guy to say, "Oh, that's funny, dude. Actually, my name's Tyler." Here's what he says, "Yeah." That's it. "Okay, hey, man, I want to come and talk to your pledges. Man, I want to help them grow in faith and leadership and character. And I'd love to do a leadership Bible study to help them be better leaders so the future of the house is better." And he goes, man, that sounds amazing. How many guys do you want? And I go, I want your 10 top pledges, 10 best guys. And he goes, okay, can you be here Friday at 2? And I was like, yeah. And he goes, they'll be there. I mean, this was like the strangest phone call. This guy was embracing this Godfather thing. I show up Friday at 2, expecting to meet this guy. He just sent one of his minions. Dude opens the door. I'm like, hey, I'm Brandon. He goes, yeah, we know you're coming. And I was like, okay. And he goes, come this way. They're over here. And there they were, 10 guys. The Godfather came through. Still don't know that guy's name. Have no idea who he is. He's probably still there. I have no idea. I get to do this study with these guys. And there was 2 guys that I got close to that semester. One of the guys' name was Brandon, and the other guy's name was Andrew. Brandon was a guy who had a little bit of an anger issue, and he also had a receding hairline. He was thinning out as a freshman. And he was a little sensitive about it. And the pledges, the other pledge brothers, his guys and his PC, figured this out. And you guys know how guys are. Like, if they know your weak spot, if they find out an area you're really sensitive, they are going to push that button over and over and over again. Well, Brandon was a big dude. He was a strong guy. He got in a lot of fights. Finally, one guy said something like, hey, I don't know, like, who's your favorite Avenger? Black Widow's Peak? I mean, I don't know what he said. He said something lame like that. Hey, man, do you want to go bowling, or are you afraid of the alleys? I mean, he was saying, he was just constantly getting these types of jokes. Well, finally, he's in the laundry room with one of the guys in the fraternity house, and this guy says something to him. And he just loses it. And he grabs the guy, and he throws him through the wall. His own pledge brother, through the wall. Brandon was far from God. But Brandon and I would meet, and we would talk through the gospel, and he was super interested in what it might look like to follow Christ. Andrew was kind of different than Brandon. He was a campus climber. He wasn't angry, but he was a partier. And so I met with Andrew almost every Friday at 11 a.m. And most Fridays when I would go to the house to pick him up, he was either still drunk or hungover. There was times I was getting like a secondhand buzz just from his breath. And I would tell Andrew every single time, hey, Andrew, you know you don't have to meet with me. And he would say this, or some form of this. This is the most important meeting of my week. I would never miss it. And so I'd meet with him every week, and we would talk through the gospel. We'd talk through what it looks like to follow Jesus. Well, so that spring, I get to tell these guys about Kaleo. And it was more of like, I felt like I was just doing my job by recruiting them. There's no way these guys are going to go. And to my surprise, they both say they want to go, which I thought was a bad idea. And I actually told them that. I sat down with Brandon at lunch and I said, hey, dude, you should not go to Kaleo. And he's like, what? And I was like, you cannot handle it. I was like, dude, it's going to eat your lunch. You're not ready. Well, I found out this is a phenomenal recruiting tactic. He's like, you don't think I can handle it? I was like, you cannot handle it. You don't think I'm ready? You are not ready. And he goes, I'm ready. And he paid his deposit that afternoon. I was like, dude, it's like, this sort of backfired, but now I use it. Andrew paid a couple days later, and they come to Kaleo. Kaleo was hard for them. Some of it self-imposed. The first day, Brandon is meeting people from different campuses, and he meets this girl, and she's in a sorority that we didn't have at our campus. She was a DG. And he goes, oh, a DG. They call you the dirty girls? I mean, idiot. And he said it to the wrong girl. She was furious. And she just goes off on him. She's like, what house are you in? And he tells her, and she goes, they call you the nasty boys? And he goes, yeah, they actually do. I mean, just didn't care, like no apology. Within 24 hours of that interaction, he's in a group of another people, and there was a girl at the project who had a little bit of a lisp. And she's talking, and there's like, I don't know, there's a group of people there. And he just is looking around like, no one's going to say anything. And he says this. He goes, oh, look at me. I'm Stephanie. I'm speaking with a British accent. And everyone's jaws just drop. By the way, that was the worst British accent you have ever heard in your life. Jaws just drop and look at him like, what are you doing? And the guy next to him goes, dude, she has a lisp. And I wish I could defend Brandon. She did not sound like she was speaking with a British accent. It was clearly a lisp. Not even close. This is his first 24 hours at Kaleo. But these guys go to Kaleo, and they had heard the gospel from me, and now they had a D group leader, and the D group leader is sharing the gospel with them, and they're having a rough time, and they're studying the Bible, and they're really having this faith. They're having to face everything in their life and figure out if they're living for the right things. And over the course of that summer, both of these guys end up trusting Christ. And they decide they want to follow and fish. And so they go back to their fraternity that had nobody following. And now there's two of them following and fishing in their house. They share the gospel that year, and they end up getting to see a couple guys show some interest. And Brandon gets asked, shockingly, to go back as a D group leader. And so that whole year, he ends up getting 3 guys from his house to go to Kaleo. These 3 guys, none of them are really following Christ, and one of them was maybe really young spiritually. And they decided what a good idea it would be on the way down to Kaleo in Florida to just take a short 3-day trip to New Orleans, just to sightsee. They go crazy at New Orleans, almost get arrested. They decide, hey, we should also get tattoos while we're here. And they decided to get tattoos on their posterior. I think we have a picture of their tats. I'm just playing. I'm not going to show you that. You guys are like, for real? They all get butt tats. And Kaleo, welcome night arrives. And you're supposed to show up between 4 to 6, and then there's welcome night from 6 to 8 or whatever it was. And here it is, it's 7 o'clock. They're still not there. And Brandon is freaking out. He's coming to me, he's like, what do I do, dude? I don't think they're going to show up. I was like, do you know where they are? And he goes, yeah. They called me yesterday and said they're in New Orleans. And I was like, oh, well, they're on their way. They finally call at 7:30. The welcome party's going to be done at 8. And they're like, hey, dude, we're in New Orleans. Sorry, man, we'll be there in about an hour. So imagine this. I know not all of you have been to Kaleo. You should all go. But for those of you that have been, imagine this picture. These guys show up. They all drove together. They show up, 3-4 hours late. They drive into the Kaleo parking lot where we're staying. Brandon goes up to the car. None of them have pants on. One of them gets out of the car. Now he does, I can't remember if he put a hat there or a shirt, but they don't have pants on. And he's like, fella, what are you doing? Where are your pants? And they're like, dude, we have new tattoos. And he's like, I don't care. Put your pants on. You've got to walk into this building and there's people outside. They're just standing there, no pants. Shockingly, that summer, these guys hear the gospel more. 2 out of the 3 of them give their lives to Christ. And they understand that what it means to follow Jesus is more than just escaping hell. It's to follow and to fish. They go back to their house. It went from 2 to 4. Now there's 4 guys following and fishing. That next year, Andrew becomes the president of the house. Jacob, one of the 3 guys with the new butt tat, becomes the pledge trainer. And now these guys are following and fishing together. I think that first year there was 4 or 5 at SMC. That next year there was almost 10. God just started to use these guys. And as God continued to use them, their house got radically impacted by the gospel. Not just by these guys, but by the gospel. All of these guys are still following Christ. One of the reasons Andrew didn't want to follow Christ is because he hated church. He hated the hypocrisy of pastors in churches, specifically youth pastors. Andrew called me about 4 years after he graduated. He was a youth pastor. I think God is hilarious. I think some of the things that we're like, I'll never do that, God's like, are you serious? You don't control things, I control things. That's exactly what you're going to do. Andrew now is a senior pastor of a church. The guy that hated church is now a pastor. Brandon came on staff for a few years with Stu Mo, and he helped launch CU, which was pretty cool. Where I went to college, now a guy that I got to see help grow and develop as a follower of Jesus was going to launch the ministry I was a part of at my alma mater. Bo is now a pastor. I often wonder how many people in his church know about that tattoo. Bo sent me a sermon just this fall, and he said, hey man, I just wanted to send this sermon I just gave. It has a lot to do with the investment you and Stumo made in my life. Brandon and Jacob, two of the guys, they now have a business together, actually just about 30 minutes from here. They're plugged into their church. They're plugged into a small group. And the small groups they've been plugged into over the years, they've invigorated those groups to be people that follow and fish. It's not just about not sinning. It's about fishing. God wants to use you guys. He wants to use you to reach others. Following Jesus is about following him and fishing. Wow. I thought for sure this thing would be dead after all that bass. You guys all know what this is. I mean, this thing definitely is going to be screwed up though, right? After all that bass. Just your common goldfish, right? Something unique about goldfish is that goldfish only grow to the environment you place them in. So when most of us think of a goldfish, this is what we think of. We think of a small fish that typically they stay in something like this. But goldfish weren't intended for this. Shockingly, they were made for more. Here's a picture of the world's largest goldfish. Check this out. "67 pounds. This is a goldfish that has grown to its potential. This goldfish was caught just last year in France. Other people have caught big goldfish like 30, 40 pounds, which to me, if you would have told me the biggest goldfish in the world was 30 pounds, I would have not believed you. This is twice the size. But this goldfish was raised in the wild. This goldfish will never grow to its potential in this environment, ever. And some of you, whether intentionally or unintentionally, have either limited, stunted, or completely inhibited your growth because of the environment you've put yourself in. Brian's talk this morning was phenomenal about that very thing. And I just want to give you two things. How do you make sure you're a person that follows and fishes? Here they are. Who's your Jerry? You've got to get somebody to disciple you. You've got to get somebody that's further along in the faith that will teach you what they know so you can pass that on to somebody else. Who's your Jerry? I know there's probably somebody sitting on your row that if I had to guess, you haven't gotten enough time with because they're a person that's a little further along following and fishing than you. If it's not somebody you know, find someone. I promise you, somebody further along in the faith, if you say, hey, would you help me grow and become more like Christ so I can fish for people? I promise you, that person will be like, absolutely. That's number one. You need to get a discipler. You need to get a Jerry. Number two, who are you discipling? You've got to fish for people. That's what it means to follow Christ. Think about this. When you fish for people, when you share the gospel, you grow. When I share, people ask me questions I don't know the answer to. And so it forces me to go back to the scriptures and find the answer. I grow spiritually when I share the gospel. Every time I share the gospel, I'm reminded of God's goodness and his grace in my life, what he's brought me from and he's brought me to, every single time. I don't want you guys to be common goldfish. You were made for more. Following Jesus has always been about a relationship with a person who wants to use you to reach other people. It's what it's always been about. And if you're not doing that, you're not following Jesus. You're singing a song with the wrong lyrics. What could God do with you? Father, thanks for tonight. And God, I praise you for people like Dave and Sean and Jerry that you used in my life. And Father, I pray that you would give this group of people the realization that they were made for more. They were made for more than just avoiding hell. They were made to reach others. God, I pray that from this room, I pray that when we're in eternity, that we'd get to hear stories of this group of people at SMC 2024 that went out and turned the world upside down for your glory and for your honor. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of that vision. God, we love you. But the only reason we loved you is because you first loved us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.